Hi, I'm Jared Fuller. Welcome to Scratching the Surface. My guest today is information designer Marco Ferrari. Marco is the co-founder of the Milan-based Studio Folder, an agency for visual design and spatial research that moves between client work, commissioned projects, and original research to produce books, brand identities, data visualizations, websites, and exhibitions, often working around themes relating to politics, geography, statecraft, and climate. In addition to his work with the studio, Marco is also the head of the information design program at Design Academy Eindhoven, where he works with students on ideas around the politics and agency of information and its modes of production. I've been following Marco and Studio Folder's work for a long time, and what I really love about it is that while he produces data visualizations, information graphics, maps around these big topics, around politics and climate, much of this work is also, to me, somewhat self-referential. I often read his work as work that is about visualization, about information, about geography. There's an implicit critique of information design and of data visualization running through all of his work that is really deeply interesting to me. So I wanted to have Marco on the show to talk about how he thinks about this work, both at Studio Folder and in his role as program director at Design Academy Eindhoven. We begin talking about Studio Folder's structure and purview, how they move between client work and self-generated work, the types of projects they work on, and how they work with collaborators, before talking more generally about this idea of critiquing information design, about the politics of data visualization and geography. On the back half, we talk about the information design program at Design Academy Eindhoven, the types of work the students do there, where they come from, and where they go after that program. And we also talk about kind of, as he's in that position, what new opportunities, what new spaces does he see for designers working today? I really appreciate the way Marco thinks about this work and the perspective he brings as a trained architect who now is working as a graphic designer or an information designer to ask these big questions of our time. Honestly, I feel like this conversation was really helpful for me in making sense of the design fields today in some new way. So I hope that you find it helpful and informative as well. If you like the show and what we do here, you can support our work by joining our Substack. We have a monthly newsletter that's free for everybody, as well as a paid tier that gets you bonus interviews every month and really helps keep this show free for everybody. I always say I hope this show feels like listening to a great conversation in a coffee shop, and really for the price of a cup of coffee a month, you can help us do this work and put more of these out into the world. Marco Ferrari, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. Really glad to be here.
I want to start with sort of a maybe like foundation setting or a very kind of base level set of questions. I want to just talk to you about some words and vocabulary for a second, just to kind of set up some of these bigger questions that I have, because you describe Studio Folder, which is the studio that you founded in 2011, as, I quote, an agency for visual research. What does that mean? How do you define visual research?
Yeah, thank you for these questions. I think we tweaked a bit and we kind of played around a bit with this definition of the last few years. So Studio Folder, I co-founded the agency with Elisa Pasquale in 2012. It's a kind of like, it's not a precise
Right.
because
As these are, yeah.
yeah, we kind of started collaborating and working together, and then it kind of like it became a studio. I think now the definition that we use is visual design and spatial research. So I'm introducing a bit of more focus on the spatial aspect of the work we do. with still through like interpreted to the lens of the visual design. So I think what we mean by that is that I think there is a core focus of the research topics, the themes that we like to investigate and inquire. That has to do a lot with space,
Hmm.
territory, and the understanding of nature infrastructure, like, a kind of a wide range, a wide spectrum of interest, but somehow has to do with territory mapping, but always understood through the lens of their representation and their existence and their kind of like lineage as images, So how space is conveyed through data and images. So in that sense, these two things kind of come together within this definition. Then obviously there is a dimension of the studio that is equally important. There's the one of the work that we do on a daily basis, which is a combination of both research commissions and project that we self-initiate or we're asked to start researching as part of exhibitions, for example, or residencies, and then the work we do for clients. And the work we do for clients that I would say is where we applied many of the skills that we developed over the years. So we kind of developed techniques and methodologies and workflows is responding to design briefs. So we operate as a visual design studio in the sense that like the tools that we use and the brief we respond to and the work we produce in terms of like the format of the work has a lot to do with the work of a visual design studio, even if not being, a fully we're not kind of limited to a specific type of work that we do.
That's exactly what my next question was going to be. I wanted to talk to you about this term agency or studio because, like you said, you have a mix of commissions. You're working with clients, you're working with partners, you're making, with these clients, you're making maps, you're making books, you're making exhibitions, you're making websites. But then you also have this kind of self-initiated research, internal research projects, things that you as a studio are interested in that seems like they don't necessarily derive from a commission. I'm interested in kind of what you're talking about there, where maybe there's some research the studio's doing that turns into a commission. Can you kind of talk to me about the overlap of the and if you have a better language for this, please tell me the sort of internal research work and then the public commissioned work. How do those start to talk to each other? Do clients see some of this research and are like, that fits into a thing we're doing? Is there client work that then turns into research work? Tell me about the structure of all of this a little bit. How do you kind of think through that?
Yeah. I'm gonna give you like a probably a non-linear answer to this
Yeah,
because
go
I
for
think
it.
we live through like a non-linear organization of this whole process in the sense that there is no structure, but there is definitely more structure than in what it used to be, 10 years ago when we started.
Yeah.
In a sense that what we can define as commission and what we can define as research, they both inform each other for
Mhm.
sure. And there is at the same time and in different moments of our work and dissatisfaction in what we do, but sometimes we would like to do more research and less commission.
Mm,
Sometimes have like a very deep satisfaction that somehow the commission that we do allow us to do more research or apply the research. I mean, apply research is a bit of like corny way of doing it, but saying it, but you know, putting in um, using the research we develop in other contexts and developing it and iterating on it
yeah.
and giving it like a different form. Um, so I think that the way in which the identity of the studio, the way in which the work of the studio developed is at the same time through fortuitous opportunities
Mhm.
and the persistence in trying to choose to collaborate on specific clients or even not to allocate our time to projects that probably in many cases would not make sense from a business perspective, but somehow try to stress on those so that we could build an idea of a studio an image of the studio from the outside would allow us to do more work in certain direction. So it's definitely a balance that you always have to kind of keep building
Yeah.
and maintaining. It's not something you achieve at any point. I don't think we achieve anything in these 10 years in terms of like they were not at the point in which you say, okay, now we only do the work we really want to do. I mean, in
Mm.
part, yeah, there's always in our kind of, the work we have at any given point is, I would say, is always very rewarding, but there's always, again, as I said before, a degree of dissatisfaction in a certain
Yeah.
way. Um, so it's a tension, definitely it's a tension. I think it's there's an understanding of our work as an agency or as a studio, and I can say a bit more about what we mean by these two different terms, but that we are able to choose what to work on.
Mm.
So there's sort of like responsibility of not just to do the work in a certain way, but also to choose to work with a specific type of institutions or clients or people. A lot of our work is also uh, becomes a relationship that is like deeper than a purely professional exchange.
Right.
It becomes like an intellectual exchange. It becomes like a participation and a collaboration on a level that is maybe always exceeds a bit the our role as like purely designers or interpreter a certain aspect of the brief. So yeah,
Yeah, you're getting to like I guess what my kind of question behind the question was, or sort of the deeper question that I was interested in, because I do think I'm going to just kind of talk a little bit, and hopefully this will turn into a question that is answerable. Because what I'm interested in, there's a couple of things in there that I'm interested in. I'm interested in the type of research that you are doing in the context that you are doing them. They are sort of, they're not. Um, you are an academic, you work in an academic institution. I don't mean this as a slight in any way, and we'll talk about education spaces later, but the fact that this research is happening within a studio environment, what does that give to the research that maybe you wouldn't be able to do if you were in more of a like a kind of permanent academic environment or a think tank or places where research is traditionally seen? But then what do you lose there? And I think that's that tension that you're talking about, where it's like you do the client work so you can get more research, but then you get that client work and then that's more client work. And so how do you start to then how do you turn that client work into, we're not just going to visualize these maps or make these maps legible, and that's just a sort of simplified example, but we're actually
yeah,
going to kind of think through this with you. How do you think through negotiating that on a kind of day-to-day basis? Do you know what I mean
yeah,
there?
yeah, totally. I think this is actually a super important point, and actually it is a point of discussion. I think it's a constant point of discussion internally within the studio,
Mm,
or no, with how we kind of like how we position the studio. Because I think this, as I said before, I don't think we arrive at any point. I don't think you never arrive. So it's a constant work of shaping the work you want to do in the future, which also might change at some
right.
point, right?
Yeah.
Studio, the studio somehow is a vessel for whatever the
Mm,
people that are part of it are. No, it
hmm.
enables them to. Um, so for me, the studio is not, a purely, no, it's not just a matter of identity. I don't
Right.
identify. It's a vessel, it's a platform, it's a vessel. So uh, I think there is, as you said, a tension between the possibility that you have to do, research, which by research, obviously, when you talk about research and design, there are going to be many interpretation of it. But we say a form of work that is not just purely responding to something, somehow is like questioning what you're doing. So I think that's, if you want to kind of simplify, uh, like doing research and design means to use certain tools, speaking certain kind of visual language, questioning those aesthetics at the same time, and somehow using every project as a way of maybe misusing a tool or misusing a
Mm,
technology.
hmm. Hmm.
In that way, kind of providing a different perspective around it. Um, I think academia obviously is the place of research in the sense that gives you the time, the money, the possibility of the relationships to do that in a full way. I think independent research exists, and I think that the value of it is that you can be more quick.
Mm,
You can do you're definitely less constrained, less resources, but less constraints. So again, there is also at the same time a frustration of not being able to do properly research because
right.
many times, many of the projects we do, they're very short because
Mm,
maybe you get a commission to pick a part in an exhibition, you get a funding for, starting doing like a few months of work around the subject or, building a prototype or whatever. Uh, and then there's an exhibition, you present the
right.
results, which are
Right.
not really, but whatever they are.
Right.
And that's it. Unless that project kind of gets picked up by another curator or it gets, you apply for a little grant or it becomes something else. So it's always this, on and off situation in which you can be lucky enough to be able to do that for a few years or on the same subject, or you have to kind of pivot to something else. So it's
Yeah.
always feel like a sort of interrupted process. I think in our history, with our let's say my longest running project, maybe the biggest project we've done, no, the Italian Limes project on the border, we were able to work on it for several years because it actually were no, we were able to get a series of commissions around it, and it kind of like kept
Mm,
sustaining. But again, in a very on and off modality. Almost always a sort of a feeling of missed opportunity when you do research independently because you think how much more serious work you would be able to do if you were in a context where research could happen, with proper funding and grants. You mentioned that I don't know if I consider myself an academic. I've been working in academia for many years now. I think since even before when I started the studio, because I love doing that. I love
mhm, mhm.
being around students. I love supporting the work of other people. I work having a conversation that I can have with students and with other colleagues when we talk about the programs, talk about the stuff that we teach together. But I never kind of worked as an academic in that way. I never kind of. I think design also exists. I think design academia exists in this kind of like weird space in which uh, somehow it's required that you run a business, you run a studio besides your academic work, because that's in many cases what gives you um, the um, the position to be able to bring something to no to the studio intended in the studio at school, the workshop. But then at the same time, that undermines your possibility to do academia properly. Yeah.
Well, I mean, and I think that's what I think is interesting about the structure or set of structures that you've built for yourself is that you've somehow allowed Studio Folder to be, like you said, this kind of living thing, this kind of platform that different types of projects and different types of kind of topologies even can fit within. It's not like you have the studio work on one side and then the like academic or research work on the other side. All of that kind of fits within the Studio Folder framework or platform or idea. That sets up a couple of questions that I have for you. And you mentioned the Italian Limes project a moment ago, which I think actually is a really, I mean, like you said, this is one of the biggest projects you've worked on. It turned into you ended up writing a book about the project. I think this speaks to a lot of these things that we're talking about, the both the kind of visualization type work, the research work. I think it speaks to the larger themes or ideas that drive the studio. So before I get into just a couple specific questions about that project, can you describe that project and what you were exploring and what you were interested in?
So the project that started as an invitation to be part of an exhibition, so the 14th Architecture Biennale in Venice. And we started a project with the idea of looking at contemporary border politics. Uh, the kind of the particular focus on climate change was not present when we formulated the initial research
Mm,
proposal because that came after our first part of the research. So the very first interest was understanding a sort of a discrepancy between a kind of an idea of Europe that is the one that I think my generation grew up with, of like, the Europe after
Mm,
uh, the Cold War, and which now becomes the sort of like utopia of open borders,
right.
free circulations of people and goods within the continent. But then obviously the reality of 21st century migration, border closures, and violence and displacement. So how those two images kind of, what is their relationship? What's their status? Um, so that was the first framing. And then we decided to immediately start looking at that question through a very specific lens, which was the actual material history of one border. So the actual very, very physical, uh, almost like architectural history or
Mm-hmm.
cartographic of the Alpine border for a series of reasons. One, because the Alpine border has been somehow historically always imagined as this sort of a natural frontier, like sort of a border that is in constant, no, never
Right.
been contested, the border, right, since the Roman Empire. And the second thing, because it's this within Europe, within a very kind of, you know, highly inhabited and transformed
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
land, a place somehow that has been romanticized as with a form of like remoteness or wilderness. So we started with this research by going into the archives of the Military Cartographic Institute of Italy to understand how exactly a border is designed. So
Mm,
again, look at border as a form of like as a result of a design process. So it's something that has a materiality that exists at the same time in the physical world, in terms of a
mm-hmm.
terrain, landscape, a series of objects that define the border as I call it as an architecture. And at the same time, the representations of the system through maps and images and
Right.
documents.
Right.
So there's like the fact that the legal representations of a border, it is materialized through images in an archive. It's not just, text.
Right.
It's actually, data, coordinates, maps, photographs, manual notations that over the course of the history of this border dramatically changed because of the different technologies that were adopted to produce those images. So I think the border itself became this sort of perfect ca- case where to study how no, the entanglement between landscape technology and images.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, so yeah, while doing this research, which took a few months, then we found that this particular fact that then became the main say way to tell the story. There was this no the impact of like melting glaciers and to the displacement of the border and the watershed, and this became like the central narrative of the work. Yeah, so that's a bit of a genesis of the project.
Yeah, I mean, what is interesting to me about that project is there are a couple things, and you touched on them a little bit, but I think that project. Let me kind of frame this in two ways, and then I'll put it to you to kind of respond or clarify or answer this question. But I think what's interesting about this, and you've talked about this in a variety of contexts, is that um, essentially states or nations and maps and the visualization of maps are codependent in some way. The creation of a map helps a state kind of define who they are, define their community, and then you design things to reinforce that in some way. And then those things that you've designed to reinforce your identity become you become dependent on those to then kind of constantly affirm your identity because of the instability of climate change, of natural kind of landscape. And so these borders that you've maybe created because they were geographic are no longer geographic. They're purely fiction. I think it is something that I kind of really took away from that project. And the reason that is interesting to me is because, or interesting to me in the context of your work, is with everything that we've talked about the kind of range of work that you do, there is a set of questions that I feel like you return to again and again. There is this sort of political kind of consequences. There's this idea of kind of military craft or statecraft. There's questions of climate change. And when I was spending time with the Italian Limes project, I kind of realized that there's this like larger question that surrounds all of your work, which is this kind of meta quality, which is like you're actually interrogating, you're not just making visualizations about geography, about military, about statecraft, but you're actually interrogating the role of data visualizations, of information graphics, of cartography, of mapping. I'm wondering if you can talk to me about this like meta research that you're using a set of tools that you're also kind of critiquing in real time through the projects themselves.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you put it like in very insightful and like generous terms. Um, yeah, I'm really interested in this in using design to questions the tools that define no the work.
Mm-hmm.
And because I think what is really interesting for me is trying to connect the dominance of certain like historical discourses or like um, certain ideas or certain interpretation of material reality or culture in general, obviously
Mm-hmm.
related to that I'm interested in, so nature, um, space, and so on. Uh, Through the way in which we can observe them. And when I say we observe them, I mean how we can record them.
Mm-hmm.
So, which is obviously like a purely technological questions. I mean, obviously there's many other layers, but I am interested in the technological aspect of it. So,
Yeah.
how do you observe something? So, what are the tools that you craft in order to be able to make that observation? Which means like entails like a huge amount of decisions. What do you look for? What do you avoid? What do you leave out? How you encode that
Mm-hmm.
that information, and what kind of transposition and representations you make of that information. So that image that comes out of this process then is almost like a feedback loop that reinforces certain
Yes.
conceptions of what
Yeah.
you observe. So these kind of feedback loops that culturally, over now human history, I think reinforce certain threads of thoughts. And I think design is what this is, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's this kind of understanding that in design is such a deep role in our culture in general because I think is responsible to in every step of this process,
Yeah.
in the design of the machines for observations, in the protocols for observations, in the editing and codification, so whatever is produced out of those observations, in the images and the communications of them. So these are very, very much design processes. So for me, always trying to kind of look at my work in that perspective as well. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I've heard you say in a couple talks that I watched to prepare for this that you are very clear to kind of to signal in some way that information design, data visualization, a map, we often see those as reality, but those are not actually reality. Those are representations of a reality, and we sometimes conflate those in some way. And I think this is what I was trying to get at in my previous comment too. Is like I feel like what a lot of your work is doing is also making us aware of that in some way. That the visualizations or the maps that you do are actually making us think about the design methods that construct that reality or construct that cultural history in some way.
Yeah, also because I think it's a form of language, right? We
Mm-hmm.
can, I think, like I think images are a fundamental way of expressing information, exchanging information. We cannot really be without we can exist without images. I
Yeah,
think also
yeah,
language is a very kind of, visual form of like communication. But it also, I mean, differently from the actual language, they're constructs. So
right.
images are always constructs. They're not natural, they're artifacts.
Yeah.
So in that sense, they depend from a lot of variables that are very, very much about the period in which they exist. So the bias, the influences, they're like depending on technologies again. So you can investigate that with this perspective.
This is maybe a weird follow-up question to that, but I'm curious, data mapping visualizations are really kind of interesting and unique ways to explore these larger questions that you're interested in that we've been talking about: nature, climate, space, spatial relations, statecraft, all of this. um, these design tools are a way to explore those topics. I'm curious kind of what came first for you. Were you interested in these larger questions around space and nature, and you found that data and information and visualization and mapping was a way to explore those things? Or were you interested in design, information, mapping, and it turned out that those bigger questions were actually like the interesting space to work in design? Kind of like what led to the other, I guess, is kind of what I'm curious about.
Yeah. Again, I don't know if I can give you like a linear answer to it, but what I recall from my, early years, I think I was always my primary interest was always um, visual design, graphic design. I think I was
Mm,
obsessed with graphic design in many ways, but not from the perspective of I think graphic design is a huge field, no, with many different domains. Um, like drawing for me was something
mm,
very interesting as a way of as a language, as a form that would bridge reasoning and mathematics, like reasoning and a way of like transcribing a form of reality in a mediated way. And in the kind of in that mediation, there could be like a lot of interesting things were happening.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
Mathematical part, there was the aesthetics part, there was the artistic part. So it's a space, it's a medium where all these things can collapse into each other. And there is now obviously the tradition and everything. So maybe I came to graphic design not from the side of like typography of no editorial, but more from drawing.
mm.
Um, then no, it happened to me that I studied architecture,
That
and
was my next question: is
I
where
realized
where did that switch happen? And then like you're kind of back now.
and I realized that I think I always said that architecture um, is a field of image making. Architecture
Yeah,
makes image. Architecture doesn't make the physical reality of the world.
yeah,
Architecture is an image making practice.
yeah.
Um,
Yeah,
so,
I've heard the designer Michael Rock, who I had on the show a long time ago. He's sort of cheekily referred to architecture as graphic design until it gets built. It is just sort of a set of images and typography, and then it becomes a space.
but I think because it's not just because a lot of architects actually only just do images. I think architecture is really a practice of image making.
Yeah, yeah, I think
It's
you're right.
it's a main form of expression. Um, and so in this sense, I realized that architecture was able to gave me the articulation to understand the aspects of like drawing and visual design that was most interested into. So this relationship between reality and its representation, what
Hmm.
kind of rules, what does it mean to define those rules? Uh, I think one of the reasons why I picked architecture because I was very indecisive about if I wanted to start like a scientific career or a humanistic career. And I was
Mm,
always kind of struggling to find a balance between the two. And I realized that architecture was a place where this
yeah.
it's like messy enough that would allow me to do both.
Yeah, this is
So
becoming a theme of this show of this like tension between two sides.
so yeah, and then it became the perfect kind of field for me to experiment and to get a bit more deep with that. Um, I'm always also very interested about you know the blending of different scales. So I think what also drawing
Mm-hmm.
allows you to do is kind of to explore subjects with different degrees of resolution. And then when a resolution and scale becomes a dominant aspect of one of the basic rules of how you set up your space of inquiry, because in drawings you have to choose what you include and what you don't include, and like what
Yeah.
scale.
So, I mean, if I'm not mistaken, you studied architecture. It's interesting to hear that your sort of first interest was graphic design, or at least more of a flavor of graphic design. But you go to study architecture, and then, if I'm not mistaken, you then continued your education. You have a degree in architectural history. Is that right?
Yeah, I did my 5 years in Venice as kind of like full architecture master, and then I did one more year, kind of like a post MA, postgraduate MA in history and theory.
Okay. So were you like when you're in architecture school, were you thinking I'm going to be an architect? I'm going to like what tell me what were you interested in then, or what were you kind of thinking about as you were getting that architecture education?
Yeah, I was really interested in the kind of the intellectual aspect of architecture, what architecture will allow you to think about. I was really interested in questions about landscapes,
Mm-hmm.
kind of the larger scale, so what's bigger than a building, and the
Mm-hmm.
role of architecture to shape politics. So the understanding of architecture is also like, you know, the military practice, a form of like a violence over people and land,
Mm-hmm.
and this, you know, is part of its not just its history, obviously, it's a contemporary role as well. So yeah, these were the questions that I was always interested in. Um, yeah, so never really looked at architecture as a profession. I was never interested in that part. I don't think I'm interested in design as a profession. I'm not, I don't negate it in the sense that
Yeah.
it's obviously like a huge part of it, and I operate within it
Right.
with, in part as a professional. And again, I'm interested to somehow role play the professional in design to understand what the stakes are there.
Yeah, that's a good way because that's when you said that I was curious about kind of how you think about that as somebody who's running an agency and teaching in a design program. When you say you're not interested in the profession, are you talking about the structures of the profession of where designers or architects are sort of expected to operate, and then what you're sort of doing is pushing up against, like, operating, pretending that you're operating within those structures, but then kind of doing different type of work?
Yeah, for me, and again, I think also the studio is a vessel of also, I think, for example, Elisa, my studio partner, has in this case different ideas than me. I think what's nice about the studio structure that allows for different perspective to live in, exist, and, you know, debate. Um, for me, I'm not interested in the professional aspect of it because I'm interested to question it, to
Yeah.
understand its role in society and you know the weight that it can have in certain processes and decisions, and how it shapes the discourse, because also profession shapes the cultural discourse, obviously. Because as a society, as a Western society, we give a lot of, you know, weight to
Right.
profession.
Right.
Uh, but me personally, I get bored after I do this same thing 2 or 3
Yeah.
times.
Yeah.
I'm not interested in kind of like building a reliable practice in many ways, which it doesn't mean to be not to be, you know, precise and thorough and reliable in the work you do. I think it's absolutely,
Yeah.
these are completely two different things. But just I'm not interested in building and maintaining infrastructure that allow me to do effectively and reliably the same thing repetitively. Which
Yeah.
again, obviously I'm overemphasizing this. I'm not, you know, diminishing the
Right.
professional,
Right.
the
No,
brilliant.
I
And just, yeah, it's my interpretation of it.
I understand. I feel I that rings true to me in my perspective, and kind of my relationship to the design world now also feels analogous to how you're describing it. I completely understand. I think what I'm hearing just from this conversation, a shared interest of ours, is less design as a industry or design as a profession and more design as a set of tools or ideas that can be applied, to a range of applications and scales and ideas that maybe are adjacent to the profession, maybe sometimes live in the profession, but also sometimes do not.
I also think, I mean, what I don't like about the idea of like design as a profession is that profession, in order to be successful, you need to be siloed into discipline
Mm.
because you need to be,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
the definition of profession has to be protective of what its boundaries, its competence, its values, and its role and responsibility are. So in order to do that, you have to exclude a lot of other things.
Right.
You have to sort of define the boundaries of where you operate. And for me, that's absolutely the opposite of what I think intellectual inquiry is. And I think
Yes.
I interpret design as an intellectual inquiry. So for me, profession is counterintuitive to the work I'm interested in doing. That said, there are brilliant designers that are amazing professionals. I really envy them because,
Right.
I think like, successful
Yeah.
businesses are, something we all need, but it's not what I'm interested in.
Yeah, no, I completely understand. I am 100% in agreement with you. I think the way you just articulated that is actually very helpful for me in kind of my position in this conversation. Also, I am curious though about maybe the flip side of that, that these things that you are interested in, territory, state, military, nature, all these things we're talking about. What is the value or what is the perspective that an architect, a designer brings to researching these topics as opposed to, say, a geographer or a political theorist or a climate researcher or a journalist? Your background, your set of tools, your position in these topics. Talk to me through that. What do designers and architects bring to these questions that maybe someone else wouldn't?
Yeah, I think for me, the main point is the ability to engage with the tools. And so to kind
Mm.
of understand how processes of transformation and representation influence a certain, uh, you know, environments or events, situations, by using those tools, by really being aware of how those tools, from a technical standpoint, operate. So there is actually this possibility of uh, exploring the technology and the technical aspects of these processes, and somehow being able to being outside of it and looking at them in
Yeah,
relation to other more theoretical, abstract, or wider issues. So I think in that sense, architecture and design, I've always have that prerogative of being able to being in uh, enmeshed in the technology and being at the same time somehow being able to zoom out and see the connections with other disciplines. Um, that said, I think this only has a value when you're in dialogue with people that have not have their
yeah,
background in other disciplines. So I don't think that is purely, and I think the way in which um, you know the cultural discourse has evolved in the last decade has demonstrated that it's not just architect that can say something
right,
about this thing. They're always in conversation with geographers, with
right.
scientists, with writers, with journalists, whatever. So there is orchestrations of voices that is fundamental to be able to um, address those
Yeah.
issues.
A part of your work that is the most curious to me, and I say that as in that it feels different than a lot of the other work, is your tenure at Domus magazine. In 2011, you were hired by the Joseph Grima, who had just become the editor in chief, to work on a redesign of that magazine, to art direct that magazine, to sort of think about the information design and editorial design of that publication. In 2013, you designed the first digital. I think it was the first digital version of
Yeah,
Domus.
yeah, the first and only, because then was dismissed
Okay,
after
okay.
something. Yeah, it was
Uh,
like
uh,
a brief moment in which iPad publication were a thing, and then they kind of disappeared.
Right. I remember that era very fondly too. I'm curious about that because I'm thinking about this in the context of design as a profession, um, kind of your interest in graphic design. That work to me seems a lot more straightforward, kind of just graphic design work. Can you just tell me a little bit about that experience and what you learned from working on that magazine, thinking about kind of issue to issue, how those things fit together, thinking about it as a brand? How does that relate to this larger body of work that you've produced?
Totally. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that was like obviously a very important, foundational moment for me. Um, both because I started working graphic design. Even before Domus, I was working on Abitare
Oh,
magazine,
right, right.
a column about drawings. So with a much more limited scope and not like pure editorial, was about research and drawing, and then became, the editorial design for Domus. I still do a lot of the work. Like a lot of the work we do at Studio Folder is editorial design work. So we still
Right.
we not something we stopped doing. But in particular, Domus obviously was a perfect place where to develop uh, a lot of ideas around the ways in which graphic design could be in conversation with the topics I was interested in. Obviously,
Mm-hmm.
because I was an architecture magazine, and no, under the directorship of Joseph was very open to interdisciplinarity,
Yeah.
questions about politics, and different ways of understanding architecture. They were not absolutely traditional ones. So it was an environment where there was a very rich discourse around all of these and a lot of ideas every time. Obviously, was an opportunity to get in touch with incredible people every month because
Mm-hmm.
as creative director, you basically are in touch with everyone that is going to be
Right.
published. You
Right.
have this conversation, you think about their work, you work with their work, you interpret it, and it's a incredible opportunity to get to know people. And then there is also the pace of the work. I think working in a magazine is, especially
Yeah.
monthly, brutal because
Yeah.
it's just never ending. It's just, constant grinding. Uh, but it kind of like really trained me to, yeah, to a pace of, moving from exploration to ideas and taking decisions and executing things and then starting over with another thing, very quickly. And also, it was a very versatile job as well because was in a single day you could do layout of an
Yeah.
article and designing a diagram, making a map, go out having a shooting with a photographer,
Mm,
being in a meeting with the tutorial board to discuss about a particular lens
yeah.
through which. So the logistics of organizing some activity for the magazine. So yeah, it was a very very diverse.
And I imagine that pace allows you to test out ideas and from month to month you can kind of explore different things that you're interested in that I probably imagine has filtered into work that you've done since or
Yeah, and I was
starts of
also
ideas.
very grateful to Joseph that somehow I think also it gave a lot of responsibility to someone who didn't have like much experience in the particular job. But I think
Right.
it was a very yeah, it was a big bet.
Well, as we head into the end of this conversation, I want to talk about teaching a little bit because since 2022, you've been the head of the information design program at the Design Academy Eindhoven. You said you're in Eindhoven right now. Uh, I'm going to ask you some terminology questions first. What is information design, or how do you think about the purview of the information design department?
So the way in which we think about information design in this program, and I say we because yeah, I act as a head, but with a really amazing and very collaborative group of people that I brought in, and they were here also some of them before I joined, that had me shape the program and constantly tweaking it. So it's definitely, I think, a shared view. Um, we think about information design as all those processes and technologies that are behind the dissemination of information.
Mm,
Uh, so I think the particularity of Design Academy is that it is a school that is very open to different media. So students traditionally can choose to do their thesis and their work in whatever media they want. So we're not a program where there is a predefined path for graduation
mm,
or a predefined medium you have to engage with or series of things you have to deliver in order to graduate. Is very, very open. But there is in information design a focus on image making technologies as a form of understanding that everything that lives in the world has a form of representation
yeah.
that is mediated by observation, as I said before, and data and editing and images.
Hmm.
And all of this is a very technological process. It's been in the past, has always been technological. These technologies changes. So we observe these technologies. So we have an idea of information design. If you think about information design as a pipeline, I think traditionally, I mean, in common language, information design, people think about it as data visualization, for example, as an
Yeah,
instance of it, very end of this pipeline. We try to kind of move our attention to the very beginning of this pipeline.
I love that.
How you take those decisions that end up being images at the end, end up being data. Uh, so by doing that, no, you still look at image, you still look at
Yeah,
the end of this pipeline. You still want to know what those images look like, what aesthetics are involved in that production. But you're aware that those images have come a long way before becoming certain images. So they're kind of their code has been developed maybe centuries ago.
yeah.
So we try to look to this kind of arc of inquiry that spans centuries in whatever kind of subject we look at. Um,
Yeah, I mean, that was what my next question was going to be. I was sort of curious about information design versus data visualization. And I've heard you say before that often by the time a data visualization is produced, the information has already been designed. And so I really appreciate that sort of moving upstream in that process. What do those classes look like, or what are students actually kind of doing day to day? How are you actually starting to explore that kind of upstream process?
yeah, so it's a 2-year program. So it's quite condensed, but also gives a student like enough time to explore a lot of different way of working or form of practice, as we often say. The 2 year are very different. So the first year is a lot of different studios and workshops and seminars.
Mm,
Some more theory heavy, some more like hands-on, some shorter, longer. But the first year is intended as a way to explore uh, a lot of different aspects of um, form of craft, form of um, exploring different softwares, learning new skills, reading a lot of different things, becoming familiar with writing. So it's
mm,
really kind of like a constant workshop of
yeah,
experimenting with things, and also bringing people, like a lot of people in that can uh, work with the students through just different methods and processes. So I think the first year is based on this idea of maximum exposures to different things. The second year is a much more a moment of focus and reflection
mm,
and the production and experimentations around one main core of work, which is the thesis, which actually start already at the end of the first year with a first understanding about certain questions, how to frame a
yeah.
questions, how to plan for field work, how to write a research protocol, what does it mean to quote your sources, cite a book,
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
very practical things and very kind of more abstract questions. And then the second year is a lot of like design iterations and writing the thesis. Um, there's one aspect of the work that we define within the department that is called the thesis as an ecosystem. So
mm,
we understand thesis as both like as many different things at the same time. So sort of academic writing, uh, a design process, a lecture, a documentation of all of these, a journal. So all of these and the relationships of these manifestations of the work is the work. There's not like a one thing above the other. Also because I think this understanding of your work, I think can prime you to, or can help you to bring this beyond the deadline of graduation, because somehow you might already have tested a different form of existence of your work that can then develop afterwards.
I'm interested in two things here that will take us to the end of this conversation. The first is I'm struck by the echoes in you and your students moving upstream in that process, that a data visualization is just the result of all of these other things that have come before it. And that's exactly kind of how we described Studio Folder at the beginning of this conversation, that you are using maps and data visualizations to interrogate maps and data visualizations also. And it seems like there's a lot of synergy there. What relationships do you see between the information design program and Studio Folder? How do they inform each other? Are there projects that are overlapping there? Is the work similar? How do you kind of negotiate between both of those sides of your work?
Yeah, I mean, obviously there are, a lot of overlaps in terms of like what I think it's interesting for me to work on in my studio, and what I bring to the students as my topics of conversation, what I propose them to look at, or what I bring on the table when I have conversation with them about their work. So my interpretation of their work is obviously influenced by my own work.
Mm-hmm.
My studio partner Lisa also, she teaches. She's now teaching in Urbino, which is another school of graphic design. So she's also
Oh yeah.
even in teaching. So I think in general, teaching is being always big part of the the balance of the studio activities. But what I'm really aware, always been very aware, that I have this kind of fear of being um, of influence the students with my practice in a way that is
Yeah.
replicating a form of like aesthetics of a way of doing the work, which for me, when I look at my work, is always flowed. It's always like it's really contextual to the the
Mm-hmm.
the I'm operating, or
Mm-hmm.
the condition in which I'm operating. So I have these kind of constant tensions in trying to bring my experience, but in support of the work of someone else, and doing this together always in a form of collectivity with the people I'm teaching with.
Yeah.
So so in a kind of in an environment that is not hierarchical, there is no, is always often contradictory. I try
Mm-hmm.
to bring people that do work different than me, especially from an aesthetical point of view, because obviously in design, aesthetics plays a huge role, and in many cases is exchanged for the meaning.
Yeah.
So and you start by looking at aesthetics. I always do all the time as well. So it can be very easy when you're in the process of learning to exchange aesthetics for an intellectual position. So I really try always to bring forward work that even I don't understand from an aesthetic perspective, or like the work I wouldn't
Right.
be able to, or I don't like from it, even like it's something I would never be close to
Right.
in aesthetics, but it's
Right.
still we can a lot. So yeah.
This sort of speaks to my last question, which I'm admittedly having a little bit of trouble articulating because it's going to sound like a really big question, because I think it is easy when you have a successful practice, or a practice that very clearly has a point of view, and then you're also in an academic setting or a teaching setting, that the even unintentionally, that you just create a bunch of students, or you mold a bunch of students to try to do the same kind of work that you're doing. And I think um, what's interesting to me about information design as a space, thinking back to our earlier conversation about our mutual disinterest in design as a profession, thinking about this moment when there's so much information all the time kind of in the world, that sort of makes me wonder what the role of the designer is, and what new roles for designers are there in thinking about information, in thinking about the structures of information as opposed to just the visualization. And so maybe I'll ask you this question in two ways. What types of work do your students go on to do after they leave the information design program? What types of opportunities do they have? What spaces do they work in? But then also, where do you want to see more generally? Where do you want to see designers working in these spaces beyond the kind of surface level, data visualization spaces?
Yeah, totally. I think the trajectories of students that graduate from the program are very diverse. Um, some of them keep doing their work as independent practitioners
Mm,
with varying degrees of, they participate in different ecosystems of,
you're right.
design production. So some of them veer more into the kind of like more artistic practice. Some of them stay in what we can define more, kind of a design
Mm,
field, even if incredibly skeptical about any boundaries between these two. I don't think it's very productive
right,
uh,
right.
to kind of distinguish between the two too much. But anyway, so independent
Yeah.
practitioners, some of them end up working in other studios.
Mm,
Some of them, they come from the background already of like, journalism
mm,
or working with larger organizations, ONGs or government organizations.
mhm,
There is a percentage of students that come to the program that are already have a background they already developed their own practice, or they come from a profession and decide to take 2 years of break to from whatever they were doing to kind of reposition themselves and think about their work and their practice. So they might go back to the same job as before in a different way or like completely change. So it's very varied. For me, the all of these. So in the presentation of the program, I try to stress that a lot. There is not a single or a narrow idea of designer that we kind of look at. We
mm,
don't want we don't want to position the students as as professionals in one or two or three specific fields,
yeah.
because we see the program at the same as well as a form of as a time of reflection and critique. So to understand okay, what can you operate, where can you operate, and how can you do that.
Hmm. Hmm.
So use that time to explore what possibilities could be ahead of you. For me, what I see, no, personally, then besides all of these, I see the role of designer as the designer as kind of as more disseminated as possible. So not as a role that has, the kind of the top decision role in any form of like a smaller or big organization, but someone that can really negotiate
Mm,
decisions making processes and design decision making processes for larger teams. I always say this kind of idea of design. So we think about design as a creative practice, so a practice that creates things. I don't think design creates anything. I think the biggest ambition of design is to actually maintain things. So
mm,
being able to do as much as possible the work of documenting the transformation of reality and the interpretation of reality, and like you can say storytelling, you can say annotating things, you can use like different metaphors for that. But in the role of the designer is really the one of a maintainer
mm.
of knowledge and information. We don't
Yeah.
create any new image. We don't create any new information. We just, repropose them. And therefore, we are responsible of that process of, maintenance, of that process of
Yeah.
carrying on information that comes from somewhere else. So in the sense, I really think about information as infrastructure,
Yeah.
and we are the kind of caretaker of that infrastructure.
I think that's a great way to end this conversation. I love that. I wish I could be a student in the information design program. It sounds great and contains all the things that I'm interested in. Marco, thank you so much. This was such a great conversation.
That was fantastic. Thank you so much, Aaron.
That was my conversation with Marco Ferrari. Our theme music is by Jeremiah Chu. The show is funded thanks to the generosity of listeners like you. If you like what we're doing, I hope you consider supporting us on Substack and get some bonus content each month. You can follow us across social media at Surface Podcast, and you can listen to all of our previous episodes wherever you get your podcasts and at our website, scratchingthesurface.fm. Thanks for listening.